Before continuing, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we investigate true stories that time has tried to bury, forgotten cases, poorly explained mysteries, and truths that still disturb us today. And leave your comments below. Where are you watching from? Your presence here is part of this silent investigation that spans decades. The Villisca Axe murder house doesn't impress by its appearance. Viewed from the street in Villisca, Iowa, it looks like just another old, light-colored wooden building, surrounded by trees that grow irregularly, as if they've never been carefully pruned. There are no fences, no exaggerated warning signs, no visible signs of danger. Yet those who pass by feel something difficult to name, a silent weight, a sense of being watched, even when all the windows seem empty. It was there that Ethan Cole parked his car on a gray autumn morning, turning off the engine more slowly than necessary. He wasn't the type of man who believed in hauntings, but he also didn't ignore statistics, historical records, or patterns of human behavior. An investigative journalist for over a decade, Ethan had built his reputation revisiting old crimes and debunking myths, revealing human flaws where the public preferred to see the supernatural. For him, the Villisca Axe murder house was just another case to be solved. The antagonist in that story wasn't a visible person. There wasn't a living suspect waiting to be unmasked, nor a classic villain lurking. The real conflict resided in the silence accumulated over more than a century, in the contradictory versions, in the incomplete files, and in the way the city had learned to live with an unsolved massacre. 8 people murdered with axe blows in 1912, an entire family and 2 children invited to spend the night. No definitive arrests, no reliable confessions, only theories. And even worse, subsequent visits claimed that people felt presences, heard footsteps, and experienced inexplicable physical sensations. Ethan carried a thin folder of documents under his arm as he passed through the small gate. Old police reports, statements from residents, newspaper clippings from the time. Everything analyzed, cross-referenced, compared. He had already found glaring errors in cases considered cursed before. He expected to find the same here, but as she climbed the 3 steps to the balcony, something changed. The front door was unlocked, as agreed with the foundation that kept the site open for controlled visits. Even so, Ethan hesitated before turning the doorknob. Not out of irrational fear, but because of a real physical discomfort, a slight pressure in his chest, similar to that feeling that precedes bad news. Upon entering, the air felt colder than outside. It wasn't just the temperature. There was an old, indefinable smell, like aged wood mixed with dust that had never been completely removed. The floor creaked underfoot, and the sound echoed more than it should have in a house that size. Ethan didn't say anything. He turned on the recorder, put it in his coat pocket, and started walking. Each room seemed preserved in an almost respectful manner, as if time had been instructed to walk slowly within its walls. The living room retained simple furniture, typical of the early 20th century. No visible signs of violence, no obvious stains. This always bothered him, the ease with which places of atrocities could seem commonplace when too clean. The main conflict began to take shape there, even without words. Ethan sought facts, while the house offered gaps. He searched for logic, while the environment returned sensations. The further he progressed, the more he realized that he was not only investigating an old crime, but confronting the way that story had been told, distorted, and perhaps protected. Upstairs, the narrow hallway seemed darker, despite the natural light streaming through the windows. Ethan stopped in front of one of the rooms, observing the spot where bodies had been found, covered with sheets, the axe left nearby, as if the killer had had time to think, to arrange the scene. Nothing there indicated any urgency. That detail always bothered him in the accounts. It wasn't an impulsive crime. It was methodical, silent, calculated. As he lightly touched the wall, Ethan felt the roughness of the old paint under his fingers. It was at that moment that an unexpected thought arose, not a long reflection, but a simple and unsettling realization. Someone knew that house very well. Someone had moved in there without turning on lights, without waking everyone at once, without leaving clear traces, and that person had never been found. The doubt, which had previously been purely intellectual, now became sensory. The Villisca axe murder house didn't need ghosts to be disturbing. The true horror lay in the possibility that the truth had been ignored, buried, or accepted as a mystery for convenience. And Ethan still had no idea that in trying to piece together the facts, he would end up finding something that no one had been looking for in the right way. Something that would completely change the narrative of that crime. Ethan Cole spent the next 2 days in Villisca without haste, observing more than asking questions. The town seemed to have learned to live with its own fame, transforming the massacre into something almost administrative. Discreet tourist brochures, well-defined visiting hours, a calculated cordiality when mentioning the house. Nothing was said in excess. Nothing was explored in depth spontaneously. He realized this right away in his first conversation with the employee at the small local museum, located a few blocks from his house. She spoke with trained fluency, repeating dates, names, and official facts as if reciting a memorized script. Whenever Ethan tried to go beyond the obvious, asking about inconsistencies in the original testimonies or about less publicized accounts, the response came with a short smile and vague phrases. The city didn't like gaps being poked. Villisca's urban landscape reinforced this feeling. Streets that were too quiet, low houses, well-maintained facades, a place that seemed to pride itself on predictability. Still, in side conversations, Ethan picked up fragments, interrupted comments, subtle changes in tone when the house's name was mentioned, silences that lasted a second longer than was comfortable. It wasn't explicit fear, it was habit. Among the secondary characters who began to take shape was Harold Meyer, a man of almost 80 years who worked as a volunteer in the historical archive. He knew every document, every photograph, and every officially recorded version. He spoke little, but observed a great deal. When Ethan asked for access to less frequently consulted materials, Harold did not refuse, but insisted on personally overseeing the research. The files revealed more than they seemed: police reports with crossed-out sections, handwritten testimonies with margins corrected later, a list of suspects that dwindled abruptly after just a few months of investigation. Ethan didn't need much explanation to understand what it indicated. There had been pressure to close the case without actually closing it. Harold never said this aloud. He merely organized papers, adjusted his glasses, and commented on dates with excessive precision. Still, his demeanor conveyed something clear. He knew more than what was in the public records, but he had learned throughout his life that certain truths don't survive when spoken out of turn. Another name began to stand out in the old accounts, that of the local reverend of the time, a respected man who had actively participated in comforting the families after the crime. His testimony had been considered crucial in dispelling initial suspicions about members of the community itself. Ethan noticed that whenever the name appeared in the newspapers of the time, the tone changed. It was less investigative, more protective. The local culture of the early 20th century helped explain this. Villisca was a deeply religious town where reputation was equivalent to social survival. Accusing someone influential meant tearing the fabric of the community. It was easier to accept a mystery than an inconvenient truth. Ethan returned to the house at different times, observing how the light transformed the rooms. During the afternoon, everything seemed more mundane. At night, even without strange noises, the structure took on a different weight. There were no easy scares, but a constant feeling that something remained out of reach, not hidden, just ignored. He began to notice patterns in visitors' accounts over the decades. The experiences varied, but there were common threads: discomfort upstairs, a feeling of being watched in the hallway, difficulty remaining in absolute silence. Ethan didn't interpret this as paranormal, but as a psychological response to an environment burdened with unresolved history. Still, one detail began to bother him. Some older, less publicized accounts mentioned subtle alterations in the arrangement of objects shortly after the crime. Furniture slightly moved, doors that didn't close exactly as described in the initial reports. It wasn't the kind of information that received prominence in popular narratives, but for Ethan, that's where the truth usually lay hidden. The antagonist of the story became more defined, not an entity, but a system of silence built up over generations. A tacit agreement to preserve the normalcy of the city, even if it meant sacrificing the truth. And at the center of it all was the house, not as a supernatural villain, but as a silent witness to human decisions, calculated omissions, and carefully edited versions. Ethan was beginning to understand that unraveling this case would mean confronting more than just an old crime. It would mean exposing choices made by people who never imagined that someone, more than a century later, would have enough patience to piece together fragments that were never meant to fit together again. And what was most disturbing was realizing that the further he advanced, the less explicit resistance he encountered. It was as if the city was curiously prepared for someone to go too far, as long as they knew how to handle what they would find. Ethan's third day in Villisca marked a clear shift in his approach. Until then, he had observed, compared, and organized. Now, he began to intervene. The conflict ceased to be merely intellectual and began to produce visible reactions in the city, in the archives, and in the way some people began to avoid him. He began by revisiting the original police reports, not to reread the main facts, but to analyze what had been left out. He was struck by the repetition of certain names in seemingly irrelevant contexts. Neighbors who provided immediate assistance, church members who entered the house before the formal isolation of the scene, respected figures who moved freely through the rooms in the hours following the massacre. Each of these presences represented an uncontrolled variable. Ethan cross-referenced schedules, testimonies, and old neighborhood maps. He realized that the official narrative always emphasized the idea of an outside intruder, someone who came from outside, killed, and disappeared. However, the logistics of the crime contradicted this hypothesis. The killer moved with precision. He knew the flooring, the creaks, the layout of the rooms. He knew exactly where to find the axe and, more importantly, where to leave it afterward. These findings were not new to the theory, but Ethan found something different: small discrepancies between the initial accounts and the versions published weeks later. Doors that were initially open were described as closed. A ground-floor window, mentioned as unlocked, disappeared from subsequent narratives. These were not random errors, they were adjustments. Obstacles began to arise when he tried to confirm these inconsistencies with local sources. Harold Meyer, normally helpful, became more cautious. He started responding with short phrases, averting his gaze when mentioning certain documents. There was no direct confrontation, but the change in attitude was clear. Someone had realized that Ethan wasn't there just to retell the story. Secondary characters began to interfere in the conflict indirectly. An amateur historian from the region, initially willing to talk, cancelled a meeting a few hours beforehand, citing personal reasons. A younger resident, who had shown curiosity about the investigation, advised Ethan not to complicate what has already been resolved by time. That phrase kept echoing. Tensions rose when Ethan requested access to a specific set of records, correspondence exchanged between local and state authorities in the months following the crime. The request wasn't formally denied, but it was pushed into an indefinite bureaucratic queue. The implicit response was clear: he was moving too fast. At home, the conflict intensified in another way. Ethan began to retrace the killer's steps based on older accounts, timing movements, testing silent hypotheses. He discovered that it was practically impossible for a stranger to act with such efficiency without making serious mistakes. The crime required intimacy with the space and absolute confidence that he would not be interrupted. This realization brought about a noticeable emotional shift. Ethan stopped viewing the case as a distant puzzle and began to perceive it as something deliberately poorly explained. There was no chaos there. There was control. A new obstacle arose when he identified a rarely cited statement given by a neighborhood child days after the crime. The account was quickly dismissed at the time as being too confusing. Upon reading it carefully, Ethan realized there was no confusion, only a lack of vocabulary. The child described a familiar figure entering the house at a time inconsistent with the official version of events. This detail was never revisited. When Ethan tried to locate the original document, he discovered that it wasn't in the main archive. It had been moved to a secondary section without clear cataloguing. It wasn't an accidental disappearance. It was a strategic relocation. The conflict now had a defined form. Ethan against decades of carefully crafted versions. Each breakthrough required overcoming subtle resistance. Each discovery came with a growing sense that the truth hadn't been lost. It had simply been pushed out of reach. And for the first time since arriving in Villisca, Ethan considered an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the mystery had never been about who killed those people, but about who decided, far too early, that this answer should not be found. As the main conflict progressed, subplots began to intertwine almost inevitably, adding layers of tension to Ethan's investigation. None of them diverted attention from the massacre itself. On the contrary, they all pointed to the same dark center, like threads converging on a knot too old to be undone without resistance. One of these subplots emerged from the very foundation that managed the Villisca Axe murder house. Officially, the goal was to preserve historical memory. Unofficially, there were clear interests in keeping the narrative within safe boundaries. Ethan realized this when he requested permission to remain in the house overnight, arguing that he needed to analyze environmental and acoustic variations. The request was denied without a plausible technical justification. It wasn't fear of the supernatural that motivated the refusal. It was control. Another complexity emerged in the figure of Margaret Lewis, a retired teacher who had spent her childhood in Villisca. Unlike other residents, she agreed to speak at length, but always inside her own home, with the curtains closed and the television on at a low volume, as if the constant sound were a form of protection. Margaret brought no material evidence, only fragmented memories, conversations overheard by chance, adults changing the subject when children approached, names that ceased to be mentioned after 1912. She wasn't directly accusing anyone. She was merely describing an atmosphere of collective restraint, as if the city had agreed, without ever verbalizing it, that certain questions shouldn't be brought to the forefront. This subplot added emotional urgency to the investigation. It wasn't just a historical error, but a silent pact passed down through generations. Ethan began to realize that many younger residents didn't even know what was missing from the story. They had simply inherited already filtered versions. Time pressure arose subtly, yet effectively. Ethan received an email from his editor requesting updates and reminding him of deadlines. The magazine's initial interest was contingent on the possibility of something new and concrete. A simple re-examination of theories wouldn't suffice. If he didn't move forward soon, the investigation could be shut down before reaching the critical point. Meanwhile, an internal tension arose as Ethan began to feel the weight of the choices he was making. Every misplaced document, every avoided conversation indicated that someone was watching his every move. There were no direct threats, but subtle signs. Doors closed earlier than usual, delayed responses, invitations that were no longer extended. A particularly disturbing subplot involved the very initial process of the police investigation in 1912. Ethan discovered that the first investigator to raise internal suspicions was quickly transferred to another city, justified by urgent need. The pattern repeated itself in other cases of the time. When the investigation threatened respected figures, it changed hands. This information did not appear as an explicit accusation, but as a banal administrative detail lost among reports. Even so, it fit perfectly into the logic of silence. All these subplots converged on a single, unsettling conclusion. The story of the Villisca axe murder house was not only poorly investigated, it was actively managed. Not by a formal conspiracy group, but by individual decisions aligned with convenience, fear, and social preservation. Tension mounted as Ethan realized he was approaching an unseen boundary. He needed to move forward, but he knew that doing so would drastically reduce his options for return. Each new discovery closed doors, while simultaneously opening others, more dangerous ones. And without fully realizing it, Ethan had already passed the point where he could simply walk away with an incomplete story. The subplots were converging, pushing him toward a revelation that would require more than analysis. It would require confrontation. The turning point didn't happen dramatically or violently. It revealed itself through an almost administrative detail buried beneath layers of normalcy, exactly as everything in that case had always been. Ethan was back in the historical archives when Harold Meyer, visibly tired, placed a box of documents on the table that wasn't listed in the official catalogue. There was no explanation, just a silent gesture, followed by a slow walk away, as if Harold had decided he wouldn't carry that weight alone anymore. Inside the box, Ethan found financial records linked to the period immediately following the massacre. Donations made to the local church, accelerated renovations on specific properties, unspecified payments to service providers. Individually, nothing seemed incriminating. Together, they formed a clear pattern of social and material reorganization. It was then that Ethan realized the real shift in the story's direction. Among the papers was a simple, almost insignificant receipt for replacing floorboards in the upstairs hallway of the house, weeks after the crime, before the arrival of state investigators. This detail had never been mentioned in the official reports. The exact location corresponded to an area described in the initial testimonies as marked by the impact. The revelation wasn't supernatural, it was logistical. Someone had deliberately altered the crime scene. This finding completely changed the focus of the investigation. It was no longer about identifying the killer, but about understanding who had the authority, access, and motivation to alter the space before the investigation gained momentum. Ethan cross-referenced dates, names, and roles. Very few people fit that profile. One of them appeared repeatedly in different contexts, the local reverend. The twist gained weight when Ethan located supplementary testimony, never attached to the main case file, in which a worker reported being called in for urgent adjustments at the house on the direct instructions of church leadership. The request allegedly came with clear instructions not to discuss the work. Emotional reactions began to manifest in a restrained but intense way. Ethan felt physical discomfort upon realizing that the most respected figure in the community had been, at the very least, an active agent in reorganizing the narrative. There was no direct proof of authorship of the crime, but there was clear evidence of interference. The turning point solidified when Ethan returned to the house and re-examined the renovated hallway. Under sidelighting, he identified a subtle difference in the pattern of the floorboards. It was there that something had been removed, not a large object, but marks, signs, perhaps traces that contradicted the official version. This discovery eliminated any possibility of passive innocence. Someone had made conscious decisions to shape history from the very beginning. The direction of the narrative changed radically. The Villisca Axe murder house ceased to be merely an unsolved crime scene and became physical proof of deliberate manipulation. The mystery lay not in what had happened that night, but in what was done in the following days. Ethan now knew he wasn't dealing with ignorance or incompetence. He was dealing with choices. Choices were made to protect reputations, preserve power structures, and ensure that the truth remained fragmented enough to never threaten the stability of the city. Silence, finally, was gaining an institutional face. The discovery didn't cause an immediate collapse, but it triggered a series of silent reactions that spread through Villisca like an underground current. Nothing exploded on the surface. Everything adjusted. And that's precisely what made the consequences all the more disturbing. Ethan didn't announce his conclusion. He simply asked different questions. Instead of who, he began asking when and why. This change was quickly noticed. Harold Meyer avoided further meetings, citing sudden commitments. The foundation responsible for the house responded to emails with calculated delays, always cordial, always evasive. The clearest reaction came from the local church. Without any direct contact, Ethan realized that doors that had previously been open had become too neutral. Access to certain community records was suddenly restricted. No charges were filed, but the message was unequivocal. The space for investigation was narrowing. On an emotional level, Ethan felt the impact gradually. There was no explicit fear, but a constant feeling of social surveillance. Conversations were interrupted when he approached. Prolonged gazes were exchanged the next instant. He understood that the city wasn't defending a specific individual, but the stability built upon silence. The consequences also impacted the public narrative. When carefully mentioning the possibility of post-crime interference in an informal conversation, Ethan noticed the immediate reaction: discomfort, mild denial, change of subject. The supernatural version, ghosts, curses, presences, seemed more acceptable than the idea of deliberate human manipulation. This revealed something essential. The myth functioned as a shield. The house, previously presented as a haunted place, resumed its original function: to distract. While visitors sought emotional experiences, the physical structure concealed evidence of very concrete decisions. Ethan realized that any attempt to dismantle this logic would encounter resistance not through force, but through organized indifference. An unexpected consequence arose when he received a response from his editor. The story was beginning to lose priority. Without a definitive revelation about the killer, interest waned. Ethan understood that the same simplification mechanism that had operated in Villisca was also at work elsewhere. Complex truths rarely survived the need for straightforward headlines. This realization deepened the internal conflict. Ethan needed to decide whether to proceed without institutional support or to end the investigation with the material already gathered. It was not just a professional choice, but an ethical one. The reactions culminated in a seemingly banal event, an informal warning that his prolonged stay in the house would no longer be well received. Nothing written, nothing official, just a polite suggestion that he finish his work. The ultimate consequence of that turning point was clear. Ethan had crossed the line of what was acceptable. The investigation was no longer tolerated because it threatened to expose not an old crime, but a system of protection built up over generations. And now, each subsequent step would have a greater cost, not in violence, but in isolation. Isolation didn't make Ethan back down. On the contrary, it imposed a definitive change in his approach. Without easy access, without institutional support, and with waning editorial interest, he needed to redefine his own way of moving forward. Overcoming this didn't come through grand pronouncements or direct confrontations, but through a silent adaptation, more cautious, more strategic. Ethan began working outside of official spaces. Instead of public archives, he sought out personal collections, forgotten family archives, boxes stored in attics and basements. The growth of his personal network became visible in the way he approached people. Fewer direct questions, more listening, less insistence, more patience. This change began to produce results. An old private correspondence lent by a distant descendant of one of the original investigators revealed something essential. From the beginning, there was an internal conviction that the murderer was not a stranger. This suspicion had been considered socially untenable, not for lack of evidence, but because of the consequences it would bring. Ethan realized that his transformation wasn't about discovering something new, but about accepting the nature of the truth that was emerging. It wouldn't come in the form of a confession or absolute proof. It would come as a set of human decisions aligned to preserve structures. Another challenge arose when Ethan revisited the house for the last time, knowing he might not have another opportunity. Instead of trying to recreate the crime, he observed the spaces as a whole. The layout of the rooms, the proximity between the church and the residence, the more discreet nighttime paths. He was no longer looking for the murderer. He was looking for the logic that had made the murder possible, and later invisible. Ethan's emotional growth became evident when he stopped feeling frustrated by the gaps. Before, they irritated him. Now, he understood them as part of the narrative. Silence ceased to be an obstacle and became evidence. This internal shift allowed him to face a new challenge, the temptation to oversimplify. Ethan knew he could write a more compelling version, suggesting direct guilt, hinting at definitive conclusions. Resisting this required professional and ethical maturity. The challenge culminated when he decided to move forward even without guarantees of immediate publication. The value of the research ceased to reside in external recognition and began to lie in the internal coherence of the work. Ethan no longer saw himself as someone trying to solve an ancient mystery, but as someone willing to document a mechanism of erasure, something more difficult to explain, but far more revealing. This personal evolution prepared him for the final stage of the story. He now understood that the climax would not come from identifying a single culprit, but from the confrontation between versions, the comfortable one and the true one. And he was prepared to stand by that difference, regardless of the consequences. The build-up to the climax wasn't marked by grand movements, but by a silent acceleration of events. Everything began to converge, and Ethan realized that time, once elastic, was now contracting. He organized all the collected material into a rigorous sequence, not just by dates, but by decisions. Each document, each omission, each alteration to the crime scene came to occupy a precise place within a logical chain. The massacre ceased to be an isolated event and became the starting point for a series of interconnected choices. The subplots began to unravel naturally. The Foundation stopped responding to messages. Harold Meyer disappeared from the archives on indefinite leave. Margaret Lewis broke off contact after one last brief conversation in which she made it clear that she had already said more than she intended to throughout her life. These closures did not bring relief. They brought focus. Tension grew as Ethan understood that there was only one possible way to conclude the investigation, to make public what he had discovered, even without a comfortable conclusion. He began to prepare the final text, not as an explicit denunciation, but as a meticulous reconstruction of facts, allowing logic itself to expose the flaws in the official narrative. The pressure of time became concrete when his stay in Villisca came to an end. There was no request for an extension. There were no formal farewells. The city simply resumed its normal rhythm, as if silently waiting for Ethan to leave. Last night, he returned to the empty house. not to investigate, but to observe. He walked through the rooms with the awareness of someone who knows that each space had already served its purpose in history. There was no expectation of discovery, only the confirmation that everything that needed to be seen had already been seen. The environment seemed unchanging, but Ethan now saw it differently, not as a scene of horror, but as a physical record of human decisions that had echoed for decades. The tension didn't come from something about to happen, but from the certainty that something would finally be said. As he left, Ethan didn't look back. The build-up to the climax was complete, not through accumulated suspense, but through clarity. All the pieces were in place. There were no narrative shortcuts left, only the direct exposition of the connections that many preferred not to see. The pace of history accelerated, not through action, but through inevitability. The final confrontation would not be physical. It would be between the comfortable version of the past and the precise reconstruction of how silence was constructed, maintained, and protected. And Ethan was about to force that collision. The climax did not occur in Villisca. It happened remotely when Ethan published the complete dossier on an independent platform outside the traditional circuit. The text made no direct accusations. It didn't point fingers at those responsible for the massacre. It did something more disturbing. It reconstructed, step by step, how the truth had been shaped from the first days after the crime. The intense action wasn't about chases or physical confrontations, but about precise exposition. Ethan presented documents side by side, initial versions juxtaposed with later revisions, omitted reforms, strategic transfers, misplaced testimonies. Each element, defensible in isolation, became indefensible when viewed together. The twist came in the heart of the material. Among the documents was a letter never publicly quoted, written by the hastily transferred researcher. In it, he described with calculated caution his conviction that the murderer had received indirect help after the crime, not to escape, but to redirect the investigation itself. The final sentence of the letter was clear and devastating. We were not prevented from doing so due to a lack of evidence, but due to an excess of consequences. This revelation changed the way everything was interpreted. Ethan's transformation became visible at that moment. He no longer tried to solve the mystery. He accepted his final form. The climax wasn't solving the crime, but revealing that it was never truly investigated. This conscious and ethical narrative choice solidified his evolution. The reactions were immediate and fragmented. Experts praised the meticulous approach. Others downplayed the impact, calling the work speculative. In Villisca, the silence was absolute. No denial, no official response, just the maintenance of normality. This silence, however, now carried a different weight. It was no longer an absence of information. It was indirect confirmation. The final twist solidified when readers began cross-referencing information on their own. Old photographs reappeared. Records of renovations were compared. The supernatural narrative began to give way to a more unsettling interpretation that the true horror lay not in the acts, but in what was done afterward. The central conflict was resolved in a unique way. There was no punishment, confession, or traditional justice. There was exposure. Ethan didn't win the city, but he won the unique version of the story. The climax concluded with the collective realization that the mystery of the Villisca Axe murder house may never have been about ghosts, but rather about the human capacity to transform moral choices into legends so that they never need to be revisited. As the weeks passed, the repercussions of the dossier took on a different rhythm than expected. There were no reopened investigations, no official pronouncements, and no immediate public revisions. What occurred was more subtle and, in a way, more definitive. The Villisca Axe murder house remained open to visitors, but something had changed. The descriptions offered to visitors became more neutral. Fewer certainties, more conditional statements. The supernatural tone, previously dominant, began to share space with cautious historical explanations. Not due to declared external pressure, but out of narrative necessity, the comfortable version could no longer stand on its own. Ethan observed everything from a distance. He did not return to Villisca. He understood that his physical presence was no longer necessary. The impact of his work did not depend on new actions, but on the permanence of the record. The text was there, available, impossible to erase without leaving a trace. On a personal level, the conclusion was less visible, but more profound. Ethan accepted that not every investigation culminates in traditional justice. Some end in displacement, from certainty to doubt, from myth to discomfort. This displacement, though unsatisfactory for many, was the most honest form of closure possible. The supporting characters also met their silent ends. Harold Meyer never commented publicly on the documents. Margaret Lewis continued her discreet routine, now with the awareness that her memories had finally found an echo. The foundation remained institutionally intact, but began to act with redoubled caution. The long-term consequences began to manifest themselves outside of Villisca. Researchers began to re-examine other historical cases considered inexplicable. The story ceased to be an isolated point and became an example of a broader pattern, that of crimes preserved as mysteries for social convenience. Ethan's journey ended not with definitive answers, but with coherence. He didn't offer relief. He offered context. And in doing so, he permanently changed how that house could be interpreted. The axe remained a symbol, but now it's shared with another, organized silence. And that, more than any legend, made the story impossible to ignore. Years later, a visitor left a simple comment in the Villisca Axe Murder House logbook. It didn't mention ghosts, noises, or strange sensations. Just a short sentence written with excessive care. Perhaps what is most frightening here is not what happened that night, but everything that was done afterward. The house remained standing, silent, fulfilling its role as it always had. Not as the guardian of a supernatural secret, but as an immovable witness to human choices that were never officially undone. And for some, that became enough. If this story caused discomfort, it served its purpose. Real mysteries aren't always solved with clear answers. Sometimes they simply force us to look at versions we'd rather not question. Throughout this narrative, you witnessed not just an old crime, but the construction of a silence that spanned generations. Now the reflection continues outside the text. Share your interpretation. Do you believe the truth has been lost over time or deliberately shaped? To what extent should communities protect their stability at the expense of truth? And how many other stories known as mysteries might conceal similar human decisions? Leave your comment. Share this story with anyone interested in true stories and in-depth narratives, and tell us where you're following it from. Your perspective is part of the continuation of this investigation.